Thanks so much, Sharon. It's really lovely to connect with my old PhD supervisor and my old supervisor at RegNet, and also to see so many wonderful friends and colleagues on today's talk. And yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to speak. It's a real pleasure, and also to learn from this wider webinar series on power in the people's health, which is so far absolutely fascinating. Reflecting on Sharon's talk last week. Okay, so today I'm talking about our work on we've been doing over the last 3 years or so on the politics of regulating baby food. This is an issue that's very close to my heart as a food systems and researcher, as a nutritionist, and as a social scientist, as someone very much interested in the global food system and global food politics. You can't, as Sharon mentioned, you can't get an issue that's more contested than this one. Just a few acknowledgements. This work is funded by the World Health Organization, and as a result of a joint effort of an international team, including some of my wonderful colleagues listed there on the screen. Okay, let me see if I can change my slides. Okay, so this presentation is largely building on these 4 presentations here. And I think Shannon is kindly going to share links to these in the chat. So if you please, this is a shameless plug. Please read these publications. Hopefully they can inform your work or thinking, especially in how to respond to this global health issue. Okay, so any talk on infant feeding has to begin with a discussion of breastfeeding and the mother-child, what we call the mother-child breastfeeding dyad. In our work, we've been framing this in terms of food systems. So the dyad represents a global on-demand food production system. It delivers an incredible, a safe and nutritious food rich in immunological factors, which protects the child against infection and helps the child to grow. It's a crucial food source, especially in in all countries. We've been working with Julie Smith, looking at this, breast milk production around the world. We're estimating about 23 billion litres of breast milk is produced every year so an incredible food source that I think is under-recognised as a food source. Largely, we talk about this issue as a health issue, but it's very much a food systems issue as well. So to achieve the best health, growth and development, WHO recommends initiating breastfeeding at birth, breastfeeding for 6 months, and then continuing breastfeeding alongside the introduction of what we call complementary foods or first foods up to 2 years of age or beyond. So in pre-industrial societies, breastfeeding duration was up to 2 years, up to 6 to 8 years, even in some pre-industrial societies. Breastfeeding duration today is obviously much less. Most countries sort of averaging around 6 to 12 months, some much less than that. Yet under half of babies realize the WHO's recommendations. Really, we're saying 23 billion litres of breast milk is produced every year. That's at 50% capacity. So there's a huge potential to increase breastfeeding rates. Estimates would save about 800,000 babies' lives a year if we were to scale breastfeeding to near universal levels. So it's not a trivial issue whatsoever. 800,000 lives of infants and young children hang in the balance. So what we've focused most of our work on recently is what we call an infant and young child feeding transition to more highly processed diets. And our work is focused on understanding growth in commercial milk formula markets, so infant formulas, but also toddler milks, which are the latest, more recent sort of emergent product category. So they were invented in the 1860s, and in Germany, and over the last 150 years or so, markets for commercial milk formulas have massively expanded. But the most rapid expansion has occurred just in the last 50 years or so. So a market of about 1.5 billion in 1978 and growing to 4 billion by 1983, 22 billion by 2005, and 55 billion by 2019. So phenomenal rate of growth. We describe this as the displacement of the breastfeeding dyad with commercial supply chains across a widening scope of mother-child populations. So we describe this as a process of marketization, of commodification, of feeding babies, and often involving the displacement of breastfeeding and breast milk. Well, we also describe that this is probably unprecedented in scale, unprecedented in human history, because of the highly populated middle-income countries in which this transition is occurring. For example, countries like China and Brazil. And the health impacts of this have been well described in the literature. I won't go into detail here because this talk is mostly focused on the regulation of these products. This is just a quick slide to say that there is huge variation between countries. To what extent countries go through a full transition to commercial milk formula diets, whereas other countries don't go through this transition at all. And what's interesting is when we compare countries at similar stages of economic development, some countries see a massive decline in breastfeeding, other countries see very little decline in breastfeeding. Some countries see a huge surge in formula consumption and commercial baby foods, other countries do not. So this is just to say that this is not an inevitable consequence of economic development. There's something very much structuring these patterns and these transitions across countries and globally. So one way of a very narrow way of explaining these global changes is to say, well, this all comes down to what mums and dads and families are choosing to feed their babies. Of course, that is a ridiculous argument because there's no way that when we just sort of see this atomized collective decision by all mothers or parents in certain countries to start formula feeding or start breastfeeding their babies. Instead, we introduced this concept of first food systems as the food systems that provision foods for infants and young children, and that structure feeding practices at the population level. So we're providing a structural explanation for these global transitions and trends. These are the main components of first food systems that we describe in our paper. And you'll notice that governance, policy, and regulatory frameworks is a huge feature of that, including policies regarding maternity entitlements and baby-friendly workplaces, policy and regulation around the marketing of these products, and there are a number of other policy areas that are really important as well. And the Factor 60 Act is interest and power. So very much looking at this through the lens of political economy. And these are some of the questions that this framework helps to answer. And this framework has been getting some really good uptake, informing some various international events, being cited by various international reports. So we're really glad to see that this is potentially a helpful way of understanding this issue. Okay, one of the key and probably the most contested and well known to those on the call today is a key piece of international regulation in this area, the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. This was adopted in 1981 by the World Health Assembly. It's been updated and strengthened multiple times since then. Going back to 1978, when it was first proposed, it was a response to the growing power of transnational corporations and was actually one of 30 such codes and guidelines adopted at the time. This is one of the most prominent ones because it's one of the few that actually managed to get up. The Reagan administration came in halfway through the process and dealt a deathly blow to lots of these other codes and guidelines, but this is one that managed to get up. Now, as of 2020, the latest monitoring report shows that although 70% of countries have adopted some of the provisions of the code into national law, there is still a very, very long way to go. The grey box in the lower right-hand side there shows the provisions, different types of provisions that have been adopted into national laws worldwide. So huge variation. This raises the question: why is this the case? Why 40 years after adopting the international code have we just not seen its full global implementation? So this is sort of one of the questions we seek to address through our study, which aims to understand the market and political practices of the baby food industry. This research is very much grounded in political economy of food systems, very much grounded in what we call the commercial determinants of health, which is a very quickly, rapidly growing research field. And these are some of the research questions that we sought to address. Who is Big Formula in the transnational industry? How has this industry evolved? What strategies and tactics has it used to shape first food systems and its commercial interests? And how can we understand all of this in terms of power, which is really a question of the primary variable in political economy analysis is power. This is the conceptual framework that we used, borrowing from some leading scholars in food systems, political economy, including Jennifer Clapp and Doris Fuchs. We conceptualize the power of corporations as really strongly grounded in as having a material basis. And this is one of the main features of contemporary globalization is the massive growth in the number and the size of transnational corporations. And as these corporations grow, as they expand, they accumulate more assets, more resources, which they can then invest in these forms of power. Instrumental, structural, and discursive. Instrumental meaning direct actor-to-actor relational power to directly affect the decision-making of someone else. Lobbying, for example, political financing, the revolving door. Structural refers to agenda-setting power, the ability to influence the decision, to structure the behavior of others, to influence the to narrow or shape the range of options available to other actors. And finally, discursive power, which is about ideation, discourse, values, beliefs, ideologies. And we saw these as being relational and corporate power in relation to other actors in first food systems, and also very much contextual. Contextual factors enable or constrain corporate power. And these contextual factors are very important for explaining why we see such huge variations in first food systems and the outcomes of these first food systems around the world. So this was our starting point to really just look at who is Big Formula and what is its material sources of power. These are the top 6 corporations. Nestle, Danone, Mead Johnson, Abbott, Friesland Campina, and Fahey. All of them, with the exception of Fahey, are transnational corporations. And between them, they controlled about 56% of the global market for commercial milk formulas in 2018. What we also found was that there had been a remarkable increase in their sales of commercial milk formulas just in 8 years between 2010 and 2018. Nestle increased its formula sales 2.6-fold, Danone 2.3-fold, more than a doubling of their sales of these products. And what we know from the literature is that these are also very highly profitable products. So they're accumulating, huge profits from this growth, I should say. Universal presence in major markets and highly resourced in terms of finance and cash, but also human resources, staff, and so on. Now, our second step was to sort of say, well, how has this industry globalized? And these figures show what we describe as the hyperglobalization of commercial baby food markets. The circles represent country milk formula production values. The arrows represent trade flows. And as you can see, the production values have hugely increased, and especially in China, other countries in Southeast Asia, which have experienced the most rapid transitions in infant young child feeding. And we see this huge increase in production and exports from, it's largely flowing from the global north into the global south. So this is, I think it's fair to say that this is an extractive process that's going on. We describe how this has happened, how this industry has evolved. It's occurred through foreign direct investment, more investments in manufacturing plants in different countries around the world. Nestle has about 40 manufacturing plants, for example, and also the liberalization of trade in agricultural commodities, and especially milk powder, which is the main ingredient used in these products. Now, as big formula have globalized, and this is well described in the food systems literature, and including many of Sharon's wonderful presentations, is that the industry's marketing follows the companies. So the advertising firms follow the corporations into these new markets, and then these marketing strategies are implemented. And marketing is a powerful force. It's there to shape social norms, beliefs, about, to make this really a socially desirable way of feeding babies. We know from very good evidence that exposure to this marketing reduces breastfeeding rates, irrespective of country context. It's high income, middle income, low income countries. If you have a lot of this marketing going on, you see reductions in breastfeeding rates. Now, we pick up on three major strategies. The first is medical marketing. This was pioneered by Henri Nestle back in the 1800s. Basically engaging health professionals, getting health professionals to recommend your formula to their patients. Bob Boyle and colleagues in the UK have shown this in relation to the marketing of specialized or therapeutic formulas, which are for medical purposes, showing a 10-fold higher prescription of these specialized formulas relative to background prevalence, what we'd expect these formulas being prescribed for. Really phenomenal influence. So this is shaping medical guidelines, but also shaping, providing education, direct continuing education to health professionals, including through large online e-learning platforms. The second strategy is direct-to-consumer advertising, mass media advertising, but also increasingly digital. And lots been written about this, surveillance capitalism and the use of these digital marketing techniques, which are now highly targeted. And we see there's some evidence of targeting, mothers at different stages of pregnancy. This idea that the companies know you're pregnant even before your family does. They can see changes in your behavior and so on. So an incredible force behind this marketing, a incredible form of power in and of itself, I should say. Strategy 3 are product strategies. And this is really important because prior to the 1980s, prior to the code being adopted in 1981, it was mostly just one infant formula product category. After the code came into force, we saw this huge diversification of products, especially products for older infants, so-called follow-up formula, but also toddler milks for young children, but then milks for pregnant women, milks for breastfeeding women, milks for older children, adolescents, and even for the elderly, targeting grandparents. And this is what we say has really widened the scope of markets. It's widened the age range of through which this process of commodification can occur. There's also very much this process of cross-promotion, whereby the companies cross-promote infant formula using these other types of formulas through similar labeling and packaging, where in countries where regulation prohibits infant formula marketing. Underpinning all of this is a huge corporate science research infrastructure. And Nestle describes itself as the world's largest private nutrition workforce, for example. They have about 5,000 nutrition scientists, food scientists, and so on working for them. And this and it is very much used to support those marketing practices through, for example, making claims on products, supporting claims on products, even though the science is very, to use a colloquial word, very dodgy. So as big formula has globalized, so has its power to market. And this is I think the key contribution of our work is that to say, look, we can't just focus on the marketing practices, regulating the marketing practices. This marketing is only made possible because the industry makes huge investments in this global, in creating regulatory environments that enable it to market. And this is where the industry's global influence network comes into play. So this is a network of Big Formula's global influence network. We see these are essentially lobby groups and we see these appearing in countries where the different companies have large material interests. So we see, for example, Nestle is the most transnationalized. Has links to more of these lobby groups, And that's why the size of the circles indicates how many connections they have. What's interesting is that we found that they have these infant nutrition associations, which are essentially lobbying on behalf of the companies in relation to infant feeding issues specifically. So resisting code implementation, it would be the main thing they do. But also very diverse and containing, for example, branding and advertising associations as well, which are there to maintain the freedom to market. These branding and advertising associations very much pushing for voluntary corporate self-regulation and so on. So we really describe this as a corporate ecosystem with these different groups serving different ecological functions in this corporate influence network. Another key strategy has been this, and this is well described in the regulatory studies literature. The shift from to multi-stakeholder governance and the rise of private standards, and we see this very much in the baby food industry too. The companies adopting their own so-called responsible responsible marketing policies, which I think it's fair to say really are there to lock in a level of regulation that is well below compliance with the international code. And in fact, these corporations are scoring about 50% of alignment with the code in terms of their corporate policies. And what we describe in the paper is that how these third-party corporate accountability initiatives and responsible financing initiatives are being used to legitimize these corporate policies and to promote the companies as responsible stakeholders. Now, shifting gears a bit here, we really describe this global influence network of the industry in action, and especially around contesting and enforcing baby food standards on a global scale. This is work led by Katie Russ at University of California, and it was really insightful, showing how what we describe in this paper is this regime complex for infant and young child nutrition, showing how we have these standards developed under a global public health regime, largely developed by the World Health Organization. We have, it includes the International Code of Marketing, for example. Then we have the international trade regime, largely centering on the World Trade Organization, but also these new generation free trade agreements that really there to establish and enforce a global a system of global trade rules. Sitting in the middle, we have the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which is the UN food standard setting body that is referenced or acknowledged in the WTO agreements. So this is really important because as the global the UN's food regulatory body that is recognized by WTO, governments implementing standards higher than Codex standards could be made to justify those standards in the WTO. So as a result of that, Codex has become increasingly politicized, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. But first, turning to the World Health Organization, and you might remember back in 2018 that it's not often that feeding babies gets into the high politics. So it's largely seen as in the low politics of internet or global governance and foreign policy. In 2018, at the World Health Assembly, the US Trump administration strongly contested a resolution to strengthen the international code. And this made huge headlines. The US government threatened to withdraw foreign aid and military support for Ecuador, the proponent of the resolution. Russia stepped in, sort of reminiscent of Cold War politics, to rally other governments to support the resolution, and the resolution did pass. But this is really just a high-profile example of a long list of influence activities at the World Health Organization to attempt to weaken the international code right from the very beginning, but also to influence a lot of the how technical guidance, new technical standards developed by WHO are considered by the World Health Assembly and integrated into the international code. So, for example, narrowing the scope of the duration of breastfeeding from 4 to 6 months, opposing guidance on inappropriate promotion of commercial baby foods for toddlers and young children. So that's sort of one area where industry contests baby food standards. Like I mentioned, Codex has become increasingly politicized. The UN food regulatory body, co-administered by WHO and FAO. Now, I was actually doing this work thinking about John Brathwaite and Peter Drahos's book, classic book, Global Business Regulation. And remember in that book, they sort of say how Codex is very strongly influenced by industry, and there's a lot of interesting history behind why Codex was established in the first place. So what we did in this work was we actually enumerated the stakeholders at Codex, both in the delegations of UN member states, so country delegations, but also observers to the relevant Codex committee that set standards on baby foods. We found is that industry representatives are very much a part of these member state delegations, and in some instances, industry representatives are the member state delegation. This is important because member state delegates have voting rights to the final say on what these Codex standards should be. So when we look at the observers to Codex, these are NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, and civil society groups. We also find that industry very, very strongly outnumbers civil society groups representing the interests of infants and young children. And on the right, you can see these are some of the contestations that have occurred within Codex over the infant formula standard and also the follow-up formula standard. And some of these concern referencing the international code and also the definition of these issues and some of the marketing practices. Now, turning to I think was just one of the most revealing parts of the research was, and again led by Katie and her team, was looking at WTO interventions in the WTO concerning milk formula. Now, the WHO published a policy brief a while ago saying there has been no arbitration in the WTO concerning commercial milk formulas. We found that there have actually been, 245 interventions, but these interventions have occurred through sub-arbitration processes. So not visible, arbitration in a dispute settlement body, but through sub-arbitration. And many of these have cited deviations from Codex standards. The regulation adopted by the country goes beyond Codex standards. Most of these interventions were from large dairy producing and countries that are home to the big formula corporations, the US, the European Union, Australia, and New Zealand. And these occurred mainly in the TBT committee, WTO accession processes, and the trade policy review body. So these are less obscure sort of processes that go on at WTO. In one instance, and this is just really brilliant investigation by Katie, was to look at how this actually played out in a given case. And here we have the case of Thailand. And we can see that it was initiated, these interventions it was initiated by the US, but then this coalition of other member states joined as this proceeded. And in this case, Thailand was moving to significantly strengthen its domestic regulations. That included expanding the definition of products from zero, I think it was 0 to 12 months to 0 to 36 months to be consistent with what WHO was recommending. And because of these interventions, we saw the product range being just 0 to 12 months in the final legislation. Also substantial reductions in elimination of criminal penalties, reductions in fines, basically a substantially weaker domestic implementation of the international code. We also found US trade representative and US Department of Agriculture documents referring to bilateral engagement. So not just happening through the WTO, but also through economic diplomacy directly to the Thai government itself. Now, I just wanted to finish with, because our work just published a few weeks ago with some wonderful colleagues in the Philippines, looked at this at the national level, and we applied the same framework, but we used a process tracing method to look at sort of forensically how has the industry grown its markets in the Philippines over decades. And we actually were given thousands of documents by some of our informants, revealing, emails and letters to from industry, and it was a really incredible data set that we had to work with. And we sort of, present in some places in forensic detail how this influence works to shape a favorable domestic regulatory environment. So we saw all of the things that we expected to see with regards to the marketing strategies underway. Well, what I think our study really showed was that, just in a surprising and quite shocking way, was the political practices of the industry. This included establishing these, remember that global influence network I described earlier? Well, those lobby groups very much prominent in the Philippines, but especially the Infant Pediatric Nutrition Association. It sounds like a professional organization. It's not, it's a corporate lobby group. And we see this coordination with other lobby groups internationally as well. So when the government attempted to more strongly regulate the marketing of milk formula, these lobby groups teamed up with their associates in the United States and elsewhere across the Southeast Asian region and put pressure on the WHO, put pressure on UNICEF, raised issues with the Philippine embassy in the United States, and so on. We also saw a lot of use of framing, and especially this productivist power, structural leverage framing, which is to say, if you implement these regulations, we will not invest. And we have the documents, it's in the paper, just literally saying exactly this. And these are not letters to the Department of Health. These are letters to the President of the Philippines and letters to the very powerful Department of Trade and Industry. We also saw these somewhat very suspicious looking groups emerging, they appeared to be civil society organizations, emphasizing that this was about an issue of choice and women's empowerment and how marketing enables women's empowerment, and also framing it in terms of rights, the right to choose, very, very prominent, which we argue strongly conflicts with the international human rights obligations of the Philippines itself. And finally, I'll just mention also this use of litigation. So the top lobby group there, PHAP, actually took the government to court in the Supreme Court, tied up the implementation of these regulations for well over, for quite a number of months, delaying the implementation of the regulations. And finally, I'll just say, we see the evidence of a shift towards more of an appeasement strategy. So what I've described so far, very conflictual, very high visibility, aggressive actions taken by industry. More recently, we've seen these partnerships, very much a multi-stakeholder governance sort of approach, involving the recruitment of senior government officials, former Miss Universe Philippines, very prominent medical doctors, into this so-called ethics committee, and a number of other partnerships with government agencies as well, or attempts at partnering, including attempts at partnering with the Department of Health on multiple occasions. Okay, in conclusion, sorry, I'm just going a little bit over time. Big Formula and the wider industry have used integrated and diverse market and political practices to shape fast food systems in their totality. So I think this is probably the first major contribution of this work, is that we're looking at these practices in relation to the system as a whole. That includes regulation, but it also includes all these, I think that is the benefit of using a political economy approach with these different conceptualizations of power. It enabled us to do that. So in summary, the power of marketing to grow and sustain high levels of commercial baby food sales is only made possible because of the large investments the industry makes in the power to market, to foster favorable policy, regulatory, knowledge environments that enable and sustain such marketing in the first place. And we argue that we're probably not going to make progress on this issue of infant feeding, of saving babies' lives, unless we consider and much more strongly regulate the political practices of the industry itself. And I'd love to discuss any ideas on that. Thank you very much.
Phil, that was fantastic. I mean, just fantastic. Would you mind, stop sharing your, yes, brilliant, lovely. I mean, if you didn't understand corporate practices before Phil spoke, I mean, you must now. Just that canvas from the global down to the national level, just outstanding. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. I've got a whole load. But before we open up for discussion, I'm going to hand over to Jensen, who's just going to make some reflections, some remarks, and then we will open up for discussion.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sharon. And thank you so much, Phil, for the presentation and for the papers and the larger research project that you've been part of. I just wanted to do a little bit of contextualization of this research and a little bit of celebration of the research, and maybe and point towards a couple of the regulatory strategies or interventions that we might start to think about that you mentioned at the end there, Phil. So this is a very big story here. Obviously, it's a big story for public health. There are measurable outcomes, and they're enormously consequential. This is also a story about globalization and the way we understand markets. So Phil has talked about the understanding of markets and the growth of markets as being really just an aggregate process of individual level decision making. And what this research shows is the inseparability of market expansion and political strategy. So in this research, Phil and the team have really explored a long-range political strategy that was targeted at creating the conditions for the kind of market that they wanted. So this is a commodification strategy. And there's some analogies, with my own research, studying the commodification of seed and the very sort of micro level practices that had to be targeted. So interestingly, it's the dyad of the mother and the baby that's being targeted. And in the case of biotechnology, it's the farmer who saves seed and then replants the seed, which is a fundamental barrier to the expansion of that market. This is, a big story here too about an understanding of globalization, which is kind of the markets and efficiency will prevail. And this is a different notion of globalization that's driven by powerful actors that are incredibly well connected. In the context of social science studies of corporate power, I've never said this before about a research project, but I find it jaw-dropping, actually. The amount of work, the way that the team has coordinated, I really can't think of a precedent in the study of any policy domain that's like this. A more typical approach is to study a particular form of power, or more specifically, a particular mechanism, whether that's lobbying, whether it's co-opting government officials, whether it's revolving doors, whether it's the production of science. But this research does it all and brings it together in a very convincing way, producing a synthetic account. And I think this is enormously important to put the whole picture together. But it's not just a macro account. It's not just descriptive. We're also zooming right in. You'll find many vignettes of the very particular interventions that were made by named people at particular times with observable consequences. And I think that's very powerful, and it's a very good way to bring macro level processes together with those micro level moments that are so crucial. The image, the image that we have here of a large corporation operating, and this very much again has strong analogies in the biotech sector, is a commercial operation that has a political operation that outsizes that of most mid-level states in terms of the degree and intensity of international connection, and certainly in terms of the amount of influence that they're able to have on international affairs in the particular domains of their interest. It's hard to come away from the research not feeling somewhat disheartened when you actually understand the way the different levers of power are systematically used and combined for extended periods of time. And the implication, and I think Phil, you already pointed to this, that obviously, focusing on food marketing is laudable and has previously had significant effects, positive effects. But there are much larger questions at stake here. To put them in the very broadest context, we could say that one of the basic questions is to say, who makes decisions around commodification? How do we decide collectively in democratic societies what are those things that should be bought and sold and traded on markets and owned privately, and what are those things that should be not? What are those practices that should be preserved because of their own value? And if we try and imagine the conditions under which making decisions of that kind would be possible, they're conditions that are radically different to those that we have today. And two, so I'm entertaining radically different ideas here. The first one, I guess they both have to do with thinking, well, what are those sources of power that could potentially be targeted? And to put this into context, and one of the I think key observations here is that one result of the public controversy and scandal around Nestle and infant formula in the 1980s was actually a redoubling of corporate strategy, intensification, and the development of ever new techniques to bring about their aims. So in thinking of any kind of intervention, you have to think, well, how could this? How would firms respond to this? So in that sense, the intervention seems necessary, seems to be more radical in nature and to specifically target the kinds of power that are at stake here. The size of corporations obviously is a key determinant of their political activity. I'll just bracket that out as something that we probably can't affect at the moment. But the discussion around science and the production of corporate science seems to be crucially important here. The asymmetrical capacity of firms to produce science that serves their interest and to distribute that science through third parties to influence regulatory decisions. One proposal that has been floated in this space recently is effectively the decommodification of regulatory science. And the basic principle there is to say that any science that will be relevant to a regulatory decision should be produced by a public agency. That doesn't mean that firms would not produce science anymore. It would mean that public agencies need to reproduce that science and that firms need to pay for the reproduction of that science. So we're in the realm of radical ideas here, but that's one way that a particular source of power could be targeted. The other thing that's significant to discursive power has to do with the public affairs strategies that firms have. That includes the leveraging and amplification of their preferred science. As you pointed to in the Philippines example, it also has to do with the creation of third-party actors who act on your behalf in a secret way. Incidentally, and as a self-promotion, I'm giving a paper on this in 2 weeks' time at RegNet. But the issue here is that firms, by way of their public affairs departments, have the capacity to intervene in public discourse, to target regulators, and to do all of this in ways that are not known to the people who are being targeted. So there needs to be a much deeper discussion around what we would term the political responsibility of firms, or perhaps their integrity. And transparency, at very least, seems crucial here, because I guess the issue at stake here is that there's manipulation of public discourse and there's manipulation of targeted actors, and that doesn't seem to be consistent, with any notion of corporate social responsibility, more particularly their political responsibilities within a democracy. We can discuss, how those concepts might actually be brought into play. But for the moment, I'd like to put it there and just restate my adjective, jaw-dropping, and congratulations, Phil, to you and the team on this really excellent work. It's been a pleasure to work through it. Thank you.
Jensen, thank you, and that's such a lovely compliment to Phil and the team's work. When Jensen says something is jaw-dropping, I take that very seriously. But also bringing in, it's such a fundamental question around commodification and decommodification, and what is our political economic system actually set up to facilitate, which is what sits behind everything I think that Phil and yourself have spoken about. I think, to me, that's one of the big questions sitting behind all of these corporate practices. So there must be, I'm sure there must be many thoughts, questions, I hope, from the audience. I'm going to come off, if I could work out how to do it, how I come off Spotlight and come on to Gallery. So if anybody has a question, please, maybe just if you could use the raise your hand function. It's because we're on we've got multiple screens because we've got 44 people joining us. So if you've got a question, use the raise hand because that alerts me to you. Paige.
Hi, how are you? I'm calling from the United States.
Lovely.
And I've been so impressed by the papers and quite excited about them, I have to say. And what Jensen had to say, my jaw has dropped as well. I'm working on a PhD, kind of shopping around for topics, and I've been circling in this arena, and these papers have really helped me narrow things down. And I kind of think I'll start with maybe a general question. I have so many, but I was struck, you mentioned about framing and the idea of first foods and systems and then food systems. And I'm wondering what the reaction has been from the food systems community, if any. Has there been any kind of turf discussion or, oh, this is so exciting that we're expanding the field? I'm wondering what that reaction has been.
Thanks so much, Paige. And also thank you, Jensen, for a really thought-provoking summary. Some of those ideas and concepts are new to me. I'd love to chat more about some of those ideas. And thanks as well, Sharon, for the kind summary too. And Paige, wonderful. Thank you for connecting with this work. So this question of why did we frame this issue of feeding babies as a food systems issue? Well, we're looking at this from a 0 to 36 months perspective. That's sort of how these foods are defined under international regulation. So it includes breastfeeding, but also these other foods, complementary foods, commercial foods, formulas, commercial complementary foods, and ultra-processed foods. That's another thing we've been doing lots of work on recently is ultra-processed foods for babies. And so this is very much a food systems issue. Also, food systems have been really high on the international agenda, the UN Food Systems Summit, for example, but also dozens of reports published recently on sustainable food systems and how food systems need to be transformed to meet climate targets and health targets and so on. And so we thought, this is not to take the issue away from the health sector, but this is just to actually insert it into the food space. And look at it through this food space to give it more visibility and also importantly to understand this issue in terms of systems. I think there's a real benefit of thinking and acting on this in terms of systems. And I guess one of the things I've been thinking about a lot about recently, and one of our brilliant PhD students at Deakin is working on, is what do we mean by regulating a system? What does it mean to regulate something from a systems perspective? If a problem is an emergent property of a system, like 800,000 babies dying a year, that's an emergent property of a system that does not protect children, how do we regulate that system? So yeah, I think that's pretty much why we decided to go down that route. And it has been well received by some people, not so well received by others, but that's okay.
That was the basis of my question, was about the reception, but thank you for that response. And I hope we can keep in touch on these issues.
Absolutely, yeah, please,
you.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you.
Phil, I'm not seeing other hands, so I'm just going to take the chair's prerogative for the moment whilst people are still thinking. So Jensen, you said, oh, this could all be so depressing, just that sort of expose of the many tentacles of corporate power, basically. Do you want to do maybe just a little reflection? And it goes to part of what you've done by using, it's a very clever strategy, I think, of using first food systems. I think that's a great strategy, and that's reclaiming power, isn't it? So it's a question of how to rebalance these power inequities, because it's not all just a given. We all have power, and there are various people on this call who are involved in very important and very influential coalitions in health and food. So do you want just a little bit of reflection of the recalibration of those power inequities?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that question. I think it's funny when you're on a talk like this, you're giving a talk, and then someone actually articulates your ideas better than you can. And Jensen really did that, I think, before, when he asked the question of what does it mean to demarketize or decommodify a particular issue? Who's making decisions about where markets and commodification, where markets should or should not go, what should or should not be subject to commodification? I think that's part of this broader narrative that we need to be, shift very much to. I mean, I guess the discourse around feeding babies is very much focused on maternity entitlements and marketing. Yes, those are fundamentally important, but there are also these broader questions of who decides, and also a question of who governs. As we showed in our work, it's not really mothers and babies or their representatives who are doing the governing. So what does it mean to give voice to mothers and children and their representatives in these global and national governance spaces? And I think that is also just something where we just are not doing right now. When we look at the Philippines, for example, mothers protesting on the streets outside the Supreme Court, but the decisions are being made by men, a bunch of male lawyers in the court. The commodification occurring in the medical and health system, largely occurring through the influence of the pediatrics profession, which is very disempowering of mothers at a very vulnerable time in their lives. So again, it's sort of like, what does it mean to give voice to mothers and babies right across these different spaces of governance? But also think, not just concretely, I mean, is it acceptable that we see these dairy producing countries going into the WTO and making intervention after intervention after intervention against a sovereign country that wants to strengthen its regulation of these products? That doesn't require evidence. That is just morally unacceptable. So how do we give rights holders much more prominence in those decision-making spaces as well? What are the mechanisms for redress when we have this global trade system that's basically giving mothers and babies a really bad deal? So yeah, love to hear anyone's thoughts.
Well, we're going to come to Paula and then to Lucy, and then I'm afraid we probably will have to stop. So maybe Paula and then Lucy together. Well, your comments, and then we'll come back to you, Phil.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks, Phil. That was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed it as well. I wanted to ask you about the code, and what you see as the prospects for the code doing anything useful in this space going forward. What are the kind of changes that might need to be made around the code, either to the code or to the way the WHO uses the code and implements the code to make it useful? Because one of my concerns is that you actually these codes come into existence and they ultimately actually form a kind of barrier to good public health policy. So as opposed to being facilitative, they actually end up as a barrier because they set a very low bar, they're misused by the industry and other interests. So I'm sort of in that global governance space about what can the code do that might be useful. Thanks, Phil.
So let me just check if, Lucy, I noticed your hands went down.
Yeah, I took my hand down, but it's interesting because I guess my quick comment was seeing how other industries are co-opting the maternal space as well. So we saw with the release of the Global Action Plan on Alcohol Strategy draft a few months ago, the alcohol industry actually got into trying to critique how women's rights as mothers and to choose how they feed their babies was being interfered with by WHO, suggesting that women should not be drinking if they were going to breastfeed or if they were ever planning on having babies. It's been very interesting to watch that, and I'm wondering around this creep, if you're seeing in the infant feeding space, this creep of other industries trying to co-opt it as well and getting even more corporate power and influence at all too, Phil. Thanks.
Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Paula, and thanks so much, Lucy, for those really great questions. In terms of the international code, I think that's a question that's nested in with a bigger question of how do we regulate, what has arguably become much more powerful transnational corporations and their practices and behaviours, and how do we do that in the absence of international law, and who has power and influence over the development of those standards in an organisation like the World Health Organization. But as I showed you, and as Katie's paper really shows, is actually like it's also influence across the regime complex. It's multi-institutional, it's Codex, it's WTO, it's ILO, it's very multifaceted. When we look at power and influence of nation states within that system, we see the large donor state, the largest donors are, of course, the same countries or member states that are home to the same corporations that we're talking about. So we have this conflict between the power of these nation state donors and the power of the corporations. WHO actually has very in its mandate, its constitution, very strong rulemaking powers. But this weakening of the code is very much a reflection of that US influence in particular, which is a reflection of the corporates influencing the US government. So I don't know how to do that better, and I'd love to talk about should we aim for like a framework convention or an international treaty? Should we nest this within a broader framework or regulation on the protection of the child or on child's rights? So sorry, I don't have the answer there.
No, I think it's a great provocation to think about. I think what you're pointing towards, and the various comments from everybody, is pointing towards a real multi-pronged approach to this. There's no one silver bullet. It's not just about a global treaty that might be important or something else. I'm afraid we are going to have to bring it to a close, just conscious of time. Phil, fantastic, just fantastic expose of these corporate practices and strategies. Jensen's reflections on the how all of this is situated within these wider governance, political economy contexts. We could spend hours talking about the possibilities for different regulatory and governance approaches to all of this. And if you are interested in some of that, then tune in for next Thursday's webinar, same time, same place, where Professor Fran Baum will be speaking about the role of people's power, civil society, with a particular example of the People's Health Movement, but how that organised transnational and local people's power can come together to help recalibrate, help to break that corporate power that Phil has so beautifully exposed. Of course, nobody's naive about it being that straightforward, but it's just be some of the strategies and tactics that might be useful, whether it's in this domain or a whole variety of other domains that relates to social and health inequities. So thank you again, Phil. That was fantastic. Thank you, Jensen, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. The recording will be available, so if you want to listen to it again or share widely, please do. So thank you. Take care.